conversations about Cage. Where should we begin?
Oh, when I was a student at Oberlin, I can distinctly remember even that. So this would have been 1969 or something like that. 1970. He was coming to the Cleveland Art Museum or something, and some people were going, and I specifically didn't go. Somehow I have a clear memory of it being a moment in my life when I was getting so involved with orchestral music and my technique of all of that, and I was tremendously interested in new music, but I was interested in I don't know. Complicated technical kinds of things, and all I knew about Cage was all the publicity kind of stuff. The silly newspaper things, attention-getting things, and I was against supporting this, and I didn't go. I then played Amores in my senior year, and that was the first time I really had some connection to the music. So then, in the first year of the Blackearth group, we Amores became a part of the repertoire. It was one of the first piece that one of the first pieces we did, and it's on that old Blackearth album. And in fact, there's another story connected to that it's related, in that even though we played it for all of those years and played it beautifully, and there was a recording, a hard to get recording of Cage playing it himself with some people in New York. And I voted against, once again, putting Amores on the Blackearth album because I thought we shouldn't be giving even 9 minutes to the most to the most famous composer on the planet. We should just be playing the music of our friends, people who needed the time. Well, I was outvoted. 3-1, and I'm forever grateful that actually Amores is on that album. And we did play it. He did hear it, and he came to Northwestern. So again, when was this? 73 or 74, something like that, maybe 73. And we played. It was, I don't remember. If we played a whole concert or we just were part of another concert where we played that piece. So we played Amores, and I've always been the pianist in that group. My piano skills are decent. I studied piano throughout Oberlin, and there are prepared piano pieces that percussionists can play. Amores is right on the edge of what percussionists themselves should be playing. It's a real piano piece, it's better to look at some others which are quite simpler. Actually, it occurs to me I could show you, and I would tell this story only because there's something about. It still tells me something about his character, about the guy himself. So in the first movement, my piano is not prepared, of course, but it starts here, it does this, and it comes to this part that goes, and then it jumps down to those notes. Well, who cares? You could make a tiny little break and go down to that note. But, I was a 20-something-year-old percussionist, and, it's written in time. So I was there, I jumped down, and I hit two notes. I hit the right note, which is prepared, but I hit the note next to it, which is not prepared. So here was this big, ugly F natural sailing out. And I was just mortified. I couldn't believe I had hit an unprepared note for playing for John Cage. And so he comes up after the concert, and I must have immediately launched into some, silly, begging his forgiveness and apologies, and it hardly ever happens. And he cut me off immediately, and he's just laughing. You see all of these pictures of him, with his mouth wide open. He always, he has this quiet, breathy laugh, and he said, "Oh, it happens to me all the time." so he said, "So you know what I do? I prepare the note right next to it. So when I miss, you can't tell." So ever since, starting then, yeah, I prepared the note next to it, and I could go flying down there with, and then since I wasn't worried about it, now in truth, for the last 30 or 40 years, I've not prepared the note next to it because I don't know, I got confident, since I didn't have to worry about it, I can do it. But it was just so sweet, and you would have to say this, that as other people have said to me over the decades, you don't become the most famous composer on the planet without wanting to, without having some energy for business acumen and all of that. But by the time I met him, he was already there, and he didn't have to be a jerk to anybody about anything. He was the sweetest guy, and all of this stuff that you might see about sensationalist publicity kinds of things to try to get people to come to concerts or whatever, all sort of fades away. And if you can actually just be with the person and get to know that person a little bit, of course he's just a deeply brilliant intellectual who, and everything he wrote and all of that stuff, it's all backed up by a brilliant guy who was, by the time he was in his late 60s, 70s, was just a sweet old grandfatherly figure, Yeah. It was also on that performance that I think we had figured out when Amores says, 7 blocks of wood, not Chinese. Just meaning, if you think about the 40s, that what they called a Chinese woodblock, we don't say that anymore, but what we know of as just a standard woodblock was identified very clearly as a Chinese woodblock, sort of to differentiate it in the early days from a temple block. So when he said 7 blocks of wood, not Chinese, somehow we understood that it was little planks of wood. So we always had, what are they, 1x4s, cut to different lengths, They have pitch, but but we were playing them always, we were very careful about, we got rosewood xylophone sticks, we were very serious about, and we, which of course which brings out the pitchiness of these things. I don't know that we necessarily were trying to bring out, we were just playing with really the best sticks we could find. But that was the other thing he said. As soon as he came up, we did the prepared piano laugh, and then and he said, and again, it's the way that he would say it. He didn't criticize us. He didn't say that's wrong. He didn't. He said, what we used, which is a lovely way of saying it. He wasn't saying you should use these. What I meant was what's right. He just said, what we used? We just flipped the sticks over and we used the back end like just the rattan. So of course we've done that ever since. Makes it so all of the double and triple and decrescendo to 4 pianos. Actually the sticks are sort of doing it for you. It's this. I think we came to refer to it as the March of the Termites sort of piece. So anyway, so that was I think that's the only the only Blackearth real connection with him was that. Though then it was in 1976 that third construction was published. Now that's, I mean, you have to think that that's kind of a fascinating story. That's like the same year as Safa, for instance. So in that sense, except for a handful of people, you know, his wives and girlfriends and dancers, you know, a little handful of people, nobody knew the third construction existed. And in that sense, it makes it almost as a score that you could have knowledge of. It's contemporary with Xenakis, with Safa. And it also, it just means that when he had all of his music published, when he began in 1962, Peters, you know, agreed to take his music, and he just went through everything he had up until that time and picked, you know, they weren't going to publish everything. They said eventually we'll publish everything, but, you know, bring us what you want most of your old stuff. And then he got interested in his current stuff. So in 62, he brought, and it's interesting that he didn't choose third construction at that time. And I can only think that the experience had been so miserable to have things.
That, right? Because his ensemble would have been dancers and friends and probably would not have sounded great. And
exactly.
That's what you mean, right? Like the experience of the performing of that piece would have been very difficult with untrained percussionists.
Exactly. That no trained percussionists would have been in the mix at that time. You know, a number of trained percussionists played ionization in that era, and even are on the Varèse's recording of that. But again, that was a very special thing. It wasn't a group of people that you were going to ordinarily, that Cage would have had access to. So it's already fascinating. He didn't choose that one. That was not. And then so they and that's another thing. You just have to be a little careful of that. Sometimes if you're putting dates on programs, you'll see this once in a while, that pieces, early percussion pieces from the late 30s or 40s, the copyright date on them is going to be 1962 because that's when he delivered them to the publisher. And once in a while, you'll see on programs that people make that little mistake. So then in the 60s, of course, as you can read in any of his writings, he was just always more interested in what he was doing then, not what he did in the past. So he just kept giving them his latest stuff, and he just kind of forgot about. So I don't know this story exactly, but it's something like, you know, one day somebody discovers under his bed, you know, a box of stuff, and hey, here's some more stuff from the 40s. Why didn't you publish this? So, oh yeah, well, I don't care if you want to publish it. Yeah. So that's how this piece actually comes in 1976. And the Blackearth group, that was, well, it was near the end, you know, of the Blackearth days. So we got the piece. Immediately we heard about this, we got the piece and started playing it. And I mean, by then that was a fascinating, you know, we were a professional percussion quartet at that time, and it was thrilling for us. You know, it was difficult and intricate, and we played it a great deal. And actually, it turns out we did the European premiere of this, you know, a couple of tours in Germany, and I don't think we even thought about it at that time. I don't. I could go and look at the programs again, but I don't remember making a big deal, you know, the Deutsches Uraufführung or whatever. I don't remember making sure that was on the program. I mean, we didn't even know. So that was another another kind of funny connection to him. He then heard percussion group play parts of that later in a music circus.
Well, one of the pieces that I saw Percussion Group Cincinnati play a few times was Credo and Us. That's one of my favorite pieces from those early pieces. Could you talk a little bit about how you interpret that piece and what you think about that one?
Yeah. Credo is a piece we've played maybe almost the most of all of those. Probably the one we played the most is the second Imaginary Landscape #2.
Oh yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's also kind of a fun story. Is that I was at a music festival with Christian Wolf, another very sweet guy, very easy to talk to be with, and we were playing his piece called "For 1, 2, or 3 People." And he said, the piece that I liked most of the old days that I've never heard since back then is Imaginary Landscape #2. Well, I'd never heard of it, and but it was published. I got the score, and it turns out to be for 5 people.
And when was this? I'm sorry, what date was this? When was this? You were having this conversation
with Christian Wolf. Well, Bill Uhas was still in the group, so it would have been probably 1981. Okay. Let's say something like 1980.
Early 80s.
Okay. So I got the score. That was one of the things that Peters had published. It's for 5 people. But clearly it was very obvious, and again, you can see this in any number of pieces of Cage and Harrison and a few others at that time, that they would have a number of people that they could count on, probably composers and pianists, I mean, maybe not yet percussionists, but they just had to have a few other things going on that any dancer or anybody who could read music could pull the lion's roar chord, right, or could twirl the ratchet or something like that. So if you have 5 people, of course, play it with 5 people. But at that time, ever since then, Percussion Group Cincinnati was a trio, and we were touring all over the country and always had European tours, and we wanted to have people hear this music that nobody had ever played in a professional way. So that was, there was a real reason to figure it out for 3 people. And it turned out it was actually not that difficult to do. We just, that's the one where we all gather around one big flat bass drum, because we have to share. There are places where one of the 4th or 5th player, does bass drum clicks, and we have to keep rim clicks, and we just have to keep passing that off. And then between us in this big circle, we put all of the sustaining instruments, the dipping water gong, the lion's roar, the coil, the amplified coil, all of that stuff, so that whichever one of us had the freest hand to the right or left could activate that thing. And in truth, I think we did fine with that. We could play the intricate, the trio of real stuff and make all the other stuff go. That's another story where, it just says an amplified coil of wire. So this is written at the time of, it's 1941. There's all these Harrison pieces around that time. I assumed that it meant a clock coil, because Lou Harrison has a number of pieces with a beautiful, a grandfather clock coil. And I thought, okay, well, it's that plus, you put a phonograph cartridge or something on the. So we were playing it like that. The first year we played it with a clock coil that we used for Lou Harrison stuff. And Cage heard us play it. Same thing. And he comes up and says, you know what I meant, what we used there. And he said, well, it's like a slinky. So everybody knows this now, but we didn't know it then. And he said, he said, yeah, I was in, in Seattle, we were in the radio station and they had sound effects in Seattle and in Chicago. He had worked in these two radio stations. And for all of these radio plays of that era, the sound effect for a thunderstorm was a coil of wire that could be amplified with a little tiny microphone. He said, that's why I used that. And that's what I meant there. So we got a slinky, and ever since then, and everybody knows that now. But actually, I wonder now if I have an old recording from 1981 or something of us. Now I want to hear it once again.
Yeah, playing with the clock coil.
Yeah, with the clock coil. So similarly, Credo, it was a similar thing where it's as though it's going to be for four people, for piano, two percussionists, and then the person who does the radio and phonograph or whatever. Again, two things. It's a real piano part, but it's within I can play it, so that was fun. I could do that. But then how to solve the problem of how to do the radio and phonograph, because it's not just turning on and off, there's volume and all of that. So Jim Cully is the one who, I don't know, did we talk about it together? Did we figured it out? I mean, he's the one who has always been the one to do that, with an old, guitar foot pedal. So he hooked up this guitar foot pedal. In those days, it was so pre-digital kind of stuff that we had an amplifier, we had to take the knob off the amplifier, attach, the coil on there. So every time he would step on the pedal, it actually literally mechanically turned, that's hilarious.
It's a mechanical device. It's not like a guitar pedal where you hook in the cable. I mean, it's got some kind of actuator or something in it, doesn't it? And turns the knob.
There's
not actuator. I don't know the word.
Yeah, but there's actually an outer sleeve around the inner thing, and it's actually just twisting. So that's how he did that.
But that was a guitar pedal. That was how they used to do guitar pedals.
Exactly.
Mechanical.
As recently as 1980, they were.
Okay. I thought it was some kind of mechanical pedal. I mean, I've seen the thing, but I just assumed I didn't know it was a guitar pedal. So
yeah, and then he also had to. He also did the phonograph, so he had to keep reaching over and picking up and putting down the phonograph. Maybe something that has felt important to me on that piece is that we at the only publication of that in that era was his manuscript. Peters published it, but it was in his very beautiful manuscript. That's not what's published anymore today by Peters. The group has always played from score. We just, reduce it down, and the older we get and the less good our eyes are, the more problematic that became. But in the 80s, it was fine. You could get it really tiny and put all these score pages up and everybody could follow. And that's how we could share parts very easily as well. So on this one, in the original score, in his handwriting, it says in the beginning, part 4, radio or phonograph, use a record such as, and then he lists, Shostakovich, Beethoven, Sibelius, whatever. But then in the score itself, again, in his beautiful little calligraphy, it specifically says, so radio or phonograph in the English language could mean you have a choice to use this one or to use that one, and maybe you'll only use this one, or maybe you'll only use that one, or maybe you'll just do it whenever you want, or back and forth, whatever. I agree that in the English language, that's not perfectly clear. In the manuscript itself, it's written in. It says phonograph, then it says radio, then you come back to this place where you play again the original material, which was phonograph. So there's only one place, and it's a completely different kind of music in the original where he writes radio. So our recording of this that we did for Mode some years ago is the way we've always played it. And, you know, again, in one sense, I would like to be very clear that he wouldn't be, the whole idea of cage and percussion and found objects and the whole story of the prepared piano, beautiful stories about this thing. It's not like he's going to tell you, no, that's wrong. You're not supposed to do that. You know, the right way to do it is only this way. So, you know, people have asked me, well, do you think it's okay if I do this with my phone, or can I do this with an iPad or something? I've even now, outside of the group, participated in performances where people, you know, have their iPad or something, and they can even switch back and forth and just call up different vintage radio shows, which is sort of fun, you know, in that sense. Cage would say, of course, that's all very amusing and creative and good for you. So in that sense, our recording of it is only just making a statement. We're playing the original manuscript in the way he did. Here's what it is. One other thing about Credo that then came up. Now this is maybe, I don't know, this is probably even 10 years ago already. I did a little winter term seminar in the 90s, I think, at Oberlin on cage. A whole month just devoted to cage. Paul Cox was a percussion student at that time. Your friend Marty from Texas A&M was in that class at that time. We talked about Credo. I made the point in there that Cage had written, you know, Credo is full of, I mean, before there was the term postmodern, that's what this piece is. In the early 1940s here, it's a pastiche of all these snippets, and he just keeps cutting in. You know, it's like the Stockhausen moment form of taking snippets of time and mixing them up and putting them, and this all makes complete sense for dancers. You know, they just say, well, give me 10 seconds of this, and now I need 30 seconds that are fast and loud, and now can you give me 50 seconds of, and you know, so this time block theory made perfect sense to Cage, and Credo was for two dancers. So it keeps switching back and forth, different kinds of music. It's all quotational. There's what he calls the cowboy song on the piano. It's a little tiny little country and western kind of tune. And then there's, you know, the boogie woogie Gershwin, like boogie woogie thing. And then sometimes the phonograph, sometimes the radio. So that's what it is. It's a very postmodern, cut up pastiche kind of piece. And it's full of all of these blocks of sound, which just have a fermata over, and they're silent. Nothing happens. It's just silence. And Cage said, when we first did it, Merce Cunningham had a text, and the dancers would say a text. I left all of these spaces for the dancers to say the text, but we lost that text decades ago. I don't know what it is. It's not so important. Who cares? Just, you know, play it with the silences. That's the way it's published. Okay, so years, decades go by. Paul Cox is doing his doctorate and is curious about this thing that I mentioned about this piece. He liked the piece. And he's in the New York City Public Library going through the Merce Cunningham archives. And here comes a box, and he opens this little box, and there are, I don't know, 17 individual written out little scraps of paper. So he starts reading these little scraps of paper, and it's a ridiculous made up fake French kind of, you know, Art Nouveau kind of, what is that called? André Breton kind of surrealist, surrealist, a goofy story that, you know, you can barely kind of follow the story. And each one is on, you know, a separate little piece of paper. And Paul says, wait a second. And so he goes and gets the score to Credo and counts up, and I don't remember if it's 17 exact, something like that. Well, there you have it. There are 17 spaces, and here are the 17 texts. And Paul just, of course, I mean, this is like, I mean, it's even exciting to tell the story now, again, 10 years later. Paul flips out and he just called me immediately. I found it, I've got it. You know? So Paul did the work, you know, Paul went through and just, you know, typed it out and put these things in the 17 spaces, and he sent it to me immediately. And there had always been, we always knew that there was an introductory program note that Cage had printed. So I thought that was interesting. So I made one more space at the beginning of the piece where the narrator would also just say this program note, which describes the silly story that's about to happen. So we added that. Okay, so we started doing this. So immediately we started doing this piece, and we found a guy here on the faculty, a good, a theater person, and we made arrangements then to find somebody in different places. We never did it ourselves. We always had a good narrator to tell this ridiculous story. It's just wonderful. And we started doing it. In the meantime, Paul writes to C.F. Peters and says, great news, I found it, well, now I'm suddenly nervous about telling the story, because what comes next, of course, is a letter from C.F. Peters' lawyers to Paul, which is supposed to come to me because I'm the one who's actually performing this. Cease and desist. You are not the owners of this property. This is our property. You cannot be doing an unauthorized performance of Credo and Us. Well, don't tell anybody, but
no one will listen to this. It's only going to go on the internet. So
right. So every performance we've done since then, of course, I give the introduction and I tell the audience the reason the narrator's name is not in the program, and then is because we're not doing it with a text. There's no narrator here. After you've left the hall, you've never heard it with a text. You don't know what anybody is talking about. It never happened.
C.F. Peters, if you're listening, Allen Otte. He can be reached at. No.
So, I mean, Paul was very sweet about it and sort of, not that he was happy it was happening, and he said, well, I'm sure someday they'll get around to it and it'll happen, and whatever, they just want to make it official or something like that and print it.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know, it's been over a decade and nothing has appeared. It's not a high priority, apparently. So that's the. Are there any other stories about Credo? I don't think so, but that's a good enough story, I think.
That's a pretty good story. Well, one of the things that I took away from working with you and on the Cage stuff was the kind of interesting, not music circus ideas, but these sort of layering of piece over, putting two pieces together over the top, or having texts that you would put over the top. Now, I suppose C.F. Peters might be coming after us for doing that as well. But the idea of, because I've done this, we did this with you, and of course I've done this with my students, is taking one of those pieces like, but what about the noise of crumbling paper? And then having them write mesostics about whatever the topic is of that moment that we wanted to reflect on, talk about, and then layering those up, or putting inlets on top of branches, on top of that, or layering up some of those more atmospheric kind of pieces. And I wonder if you had some ideas about
I'm remembering again. I have, how you have some memories where you you see the picture of the time and place exactly, the conversation and whatever. And there was, I don't know when, also in the 80s, I guess, when I had this conversation with Jim Cully came out here to the woods, my house in the woods, and we were walking because I had this idea because there are, once he got into the 1960s, there are so many Cage pieces where he's just providing material, and he says, play as little or as much of it as you want, and that constitutes the piece. It doesn't. You don't have to use all of this material. Combining that idea with the idea of a music circus that we knew that he had already in 1963 done these things of music circus, meaning a 3-ring circus just means more than one thing going on at the same time. So I had this thought that, as we added more and more Cage things to the repertoire and wanted to do, reminds me that another thing, I guess we also did so Percussion Group Cincinnati would have done we did the European premiere of Branches, because what year would that have been? Maybe 1982 or something like that. So Cage, when Cage first did Branches, it was something he made for himself to accompany the dance of Cunningham and Company. Then the group got this, we were part of a festival in Germany, outside of Cologne. And Cage was going to be the invited guest. So the organizers of the festival put me in touch with Cage about what we were going to play. They said, just work out a program. So we were working on, we had mostly old pieces that we did, different versions of these things. And he wrote, and I still have the little mail gram, he did these things where he would write, and then there would be carbon copies attached to it. And I can't imagine anybody getting a mailgram with Cage's, writing on it, actually then tore it off and sent it back. Right. So I responded on a different piece of paper. He said, yes, I see you're playing all of the pieces from the 40s and all of that. I have a new piece which you might find interesting. It's just been published. It's called Branches. Well, I'll have Peter send it to you. And again, we didn't think about it at that time, but it just means that he had been playing it himself for the company, and now he said, it's just been published and I'll send it to you. So he sent it to us, and so we did it at so it's Child of Tree, just however many people play Child of Tree simultaneously is Branches, right? So so meaning that he had played Child of Tree, which, by the way, not everybody remembers, then the beautiful piece called Wonderful Widow of 18 Springs. Yeah. Beautiful, little folk-like vocalese with a closed piano, which needs a percussionist. The tiny little excerpt from James Joyce Finnegan's Wake, da-da-da-dum-bum, Child of Tree. That's where that
comes from. Yeah,
that's where it comes from. So, yeah. Okay, so we played Branches, and he saw us play Branches, and that's another interesting story, kind of that. We were completely sympathetic to the philosophy. We knew other pieces, other new pieces. I'd read lots of the books and had met him a couple of times, and so we were, honestly coming at it from the right, with the right attitude. His comment about our playing it was that it was much too theatrical, and I was and maybe he was, contrary to what I've said before, it seemed I don't know if he criticized, again, maybe he wasn't criticizing. He just said, you know, I'll send you my video. You can see how I do it. But he found, and I was so surprised because we understood that this was not about us doing cool stuff.
Right.
We were not there to be watched while we did silly things or amusing things. We just quietly went about our business, doing our things by the clock timing. And yet, I think we had found such beautiful, fascinating things to do.
Yeah.
That he found it too theatrical. I don't know how much we toned it down a little bit since then, but it's such a lovely piece to do all of that kind
Well,
of
and you
stuff.
see the films of him playing it where he's sitting in a chair and he's just brushing the cactus with a feather,
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's what he intended. It's, give that to a percussionist. We're probably going to do more than that. We're probably going to find more things to do. But that is, that is a funny
Yeah.
story.
But it was from that experience also of playing something like Branches and knowing that you could just keep doing calculations and do it as many times as however long the dance was going to be or whatever, that had given me this idea that we could do pieces and on the whole history of percussion group programs, you would find many, many programs which have something called, which we're calling from, through, to. So on the program, it says from Amores through some of Branches and first something else, whatever, to part of Imaginary Landscape number 2, something like that. So it wasn't really so much of a music circus where they were all layered, but we made a little journey that was all connected, and it would, like the to go from Amores to Branches, we did a lot of the time, because when you get to the movement with the little wooden movement, we would kind of start that, and then one by one, we'd go over to the Branches table and start breaking twigs or something. And it just made a perfect little transition into a whole other world,
Oh, wow.
that kind of thing. And then we'd come out of that, so.
So we're reaching the end of our hour here. So I feel like there's probably a part 2 in here somewhere that we could talk more about this. We're just scratching the surface here. So do you have any closing thoughts about to leave us with for this time, and we'll pick up with a part 2?
Yeah. In the good luck of having had a couple of tours with him, in one in Italy and one in Germany and in this country, where he respected, I was very young. He respected us because we were doing a good job. We were taking this very seriously, and we did a good job. And so he was very, very sweet and friendly. And even, on these European tours, we'd be in the same little pension, the same little hotel or something like that, and come down to breakfast. And I, he wasn't going to be presumptive about anything, but he would always gesture, "Oh no, come over and sit down." I'd sit down and have breakfast because he was being so, warm and friendly. And at concerts, if this was a music festival in any of these countries, there would be lots of concerts of other people doing other things, not just Cage, but it's a new music festival. He went to everything. He sat there. I would sit next to him, and he would have comments. If people would play his own music, he would turn to me with that big quiet, that silly laugh, and kind of whisper, "I don't think that's what I wrote." And I'd be angry and couldn't believe that this person had, trashed his score in that way and hadn't understood the underlying principles and all of that, and have my strong opinion. And he would just laugh and say, and then he'd go up on stage and hug the person and be the sweetest guy. So, I mean, that was a nice lesson about just, letting go of this kind of stuff. And there were other times, there was another one where there was a very fancy, sophisticated, virtuoso, brand new piano piece, by a German composer, all over the keyboard, and at the end of it, and Cage turns to me, and I mean, he doesn't have to impress me with anything. I mean, what does he care what I think or whatever? I mean, it was meaning I just took it to be what he really was thinking, at that moment, what he really felt. And he turns and he says, I think Chopin did it better. And does this laugh. And I understood that he knew what he was talking about, that Chopin's sense of idiomatic gestures on the keyboard and how things would range and compress and overlap, and what would be, again, sort of idiomatic, or where you would push the idiomatic gestures for musical purposes. Cage knew what he was talking about, and just made a little joke about it, that he understood, and and I'm sure he just gave the young composer a hug afterwards or whatever. So the closing thought was that I really came to I mean, I had the personal experience, since there was no reason for him to need to impress me with anything at all. It was just totally honest, and that the guy was totally well read in the whole history, not only of Western literature, but of its music as well. And he made different music because he knew what other people had done before him. Okay, fine, you can like that or not like it or love it, or so, but we need to now make something different. So
this seems like a good pause, and I do think we have more to talk about with this. I feel like there's more. So let's come back for another part, and we'll pause here for now.
Okay. Okay, great. Good. Thanks. Thank you.